It was late Sunday evening, and the house felt strangely still. The kind of quiet where you can hear the fridge humming and the clock ticking in the hall. Then I heard the front door click open, and there was Mark, suitcase trailing behind him, flashing that tired but charming smile he always wore after a long business trip. He looked rumpled, worn out, like a man who'd been trapped in endless meetings. He kissed my cheek and started telling me how exhausting it all had been, how he could barely keep his eyes open. I laughed softly, relieved to have him back, ready for his usual little stories from the road. We headed to the bedroom together, chatting as I unzipped his suitcase. Out came neatly folded shirts. Mark had never been this tidy before I met him. Then his toiletries, a paperback with the corner turned down, a crumpled city map. My hand reached in again and brushed against something silky. I pulled it out slowly, and my heart stopped. A lacy bra. Black. Delicate. Not mine. Not even close to my size. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation, but my stomach dropped before I could find one. Trying to keep my voice steady, I held it up. "Whose is this?" I asked. Mark's laugh came a little too fast, a little too light. "Oh, must have been a laundry mix-up at the hotel," he said, like it was nothing. I watched him for a beat longer than usual, searching his face for even the tiniest crack. He smiled, but something between us shifted right then. Something I couldn't name yet, but I could feel it in my bones. I slipped the bra back into the suitcase, pretending to brush it off the way he wanted me to. But my mind was already replaying the moment over and over, like a record stuck on the same scratch. A laundry mix-up? Sure. Maybe if it had been a plain white t-shirt or a pair of socks. But this? This was intimate. This was chosen. And I couldn't shake the image of someone else's hands folding it, someone else's body wearing it. I smiled faintly, nodding along to whatever story Mark was spinning, but I wasn't really listening anymore. He went on about his meetings, the long hours, the networking dinners that ran late into the night. Every word felt suddenly loaded, each detail making me question what else might be buried under the surface. I caught the faintest scent on his shirt. Sweet, floral, not my perfume. It clung to him in a way that didn't feel accidental. My chest tightened, but I kept my tone light, tossing in the occasional, "Oh, really?" so he wouldn't see how my thoughts were unraveling. When he finally wandered off toward the shower, whistling like nothing was wrong, I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. My hands rested in my lap, but inside I was gripping the truth, whatever it was, like a blade I wasn't ready to show. I told myself it could wait. I told myself I needed to be sure. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to fade away with a good night's sleep. Something had been set in motion and I wasn't about to stop it. The sound of the shower started up in the bathroom, muffled by the closed door. I sat there for a moment, staring at the suitcase, my mind running in 100 directions. The bra wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was a message, and I didn't know if it had been left for me to find or hidden carelessly, assuming I wouldn't look. Either way, it was careless. Either way, it spoke louder than any excuse he'd just given me. I started unpacking the rest of his things, more for the motion than for necessity. Each item felt heavier than it should have, like it was carrying a secret with it. I thought about all the years we'd been together, the trust I'd built in him brick by brick, and how one moment, a scrap of lace, had cracked the foundation in ways I couldn't yet measure. I didn't feel rage. Not yet. What I felt was sharper, colder, the beginning of clarity. When he finally came out, hair damp and smelling of soap, he smiled at me like nothing in the world was wrong. I smiled back, tucking away the storm in my chest. This wasn't the time. Not tonight. I knew that if I waited, if I listened and watched, I'd find the truth on my own terms. And when I did, I wouldn't just confront him. I'd make sure he regretted underestimating me. By morning, The unease had settled into something heavier, like a stone lodged in my chest. Mark moved around the kitchen making coffee, humming to himself, while I sat at the table pretending to scroll through my phone. Every word he said sounded perfectly normal, but now I was hearing them differently, like I was listening for static behind the music. He left for work with a kiss on my forehead, and I watched him walk out the door, my mind already circling back to the bra. That night, when he stepped into the shower, I knew I couldn't just sit there wondering. I reached for his jacket draped over the chair and started checking the pockets. My hands felt steady, but inside, my heart was pounding. That's when I found it, a folded receipt from the hotel bar. 2 cocktails, a bottle of champagne, dessert for 2. My breath caught, and I stared at it like it might explain itself if I waited long enough. But it didn't. I set the paper on the dresser, my fingers grazing the faint perfume on one of his shirts. It was stronger now, unmistakable, like a ghost in the fabric. I didn't recognize the scent, but I knew it didn't belong to me. A wave of cold washed over me, not from shock, but from confirmation. Something was wrong, and whatever it was, he was keeping it from me. I folded the receipt carefully, almost tenderly, and slipped it into my own drawer, right next to the bra I'd hidden the night before. Seeing them together felt powerful, like pieces of a puzzle only I knew existed. I could have marched into the bathroom, thrown open the door, and demanded answers right then. But what would that give me? A lie? Maybe 2, wrapped in the same careless charm he always used to smooth things over. No, if I was going to confront him, I needed more than suspicion. I needed undeniable proof. When he came out of the shower, steam curling around him, he started talking about some funny thing that happened at work. I nodded and smiled, pretending to listen, every muscle in my face holding its place like I was made of porcelain. Inside, though, something had shifted. The balance of power between us had tilted, and he didn't even notice. He thought I was in the same place I'd been yesterday, trusting, unguarded. He couldn't have been more wrong. That night, lying beside him in bed, I stared at the ceiling while his breathing slowed into sleep. My mind was already planning, mapping out the next steps. I'd watch. I'd wait. And when I moved, it wouldn't be out of impulse. It would be calculated. I wanted him caught so completely that not even his best story could save him. The next morning, I woke before him, just lying there, studying his face in the dim light. He looked peaceful, almost boyish, like someone who didn't have a care in the world. It was strange, seeing him like that while knowing what I knew. I wondered if he felt any flicker of guilt at all, or if the lies came so naturally now that they didn't even register. He stirred, smiled, and kissed my cheek before heading for the shower, and I realized he had no idea the ground beneath him was shifting. As soon as the water started running, I got up and opened my drawer again. The bra. The receipt. I ran my fingers over them, memorizing their presence like a secret I could feel under my skin. These weren't just random objects anymore. They were evidence, seeds of a truth that would, sooner or later, sprout into something undeniable. I wasn't afraid of what I'd find next. I was ready for it. By the time he stepped out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, I was smiling, offering him coffee like everything was fine. And it was fine. For now. Because the longer I stayed quiet, the more space I had to listen, to observe, to catch the little cracks in his stories. Something told me the next slip-up was coming. And when it did, I'd be ready to catch it before it hit the floor. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of quiet, ordinary start to the day where nothing feels like it's about to change. Mark was in the shower, steam already fogging up the bathroom mirror, when I reached for his phone on the nightstand. My excuse was ready if he caught me. Just checking the time. But my heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it could give me away. I unlocked it with his passcode, the one I'd known for years, and scrolled straight to his messages. One contact stood out immediately. The name was male, but the tone of the texts was not. Flirtatious, teasing, dripping with the kind of intimacy you don't fake. I scrolled further, my stomach tightening with every line. The words were explicit, private in a way that made me feel like an intruder, except I had every right to be there. Then I saw it, a photo of the bra, the same one sitting in my drawer. My hands went cold. Beneath it, her message read, "Can't wait for you to take this off me again." I didn't react, not outwardly. I just kept scrolling, every message tightening the knot in my chest until it felt hard to breathe. And yet, with each word, I felt less like a victim and more like someone sharpening a blade. This wasn't a maybe anymore, this was proof. And now I knew exactly where the power sat, right in my hands. I started taking photos, quick, precise, making sure every message, every timestamp, every image was captured. My hands didn't shake. In fact, I felt strangely calm, like I'd crossed a threshold where anger had given way to clarity. I saved everything to a hidden folder on my own phone, double-checking each shot before deleting my traces from his. The sound of the shower water was steady, almost hypnotic, like it was marking the seconds I had left before he stepped out. As I worked, my mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't going to be a quiet confrontation in our kitchen, or a whispered argument behind closed doors. No, that would be too easy for him. Too private. I wanted something he couldn't spin, couldn't soften with charm, something that would strip away the mask he wore so effortlessly. And for that, I'd need timing, precision, and an audience. By the time I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, my plan had started to take shape. It wasn't complete yet, but the bones were there. I wasn't just going to catch him. I was going to make sure everyone who mattered to him knew exactly who he really was. The shower shut off, and I moved quickly, sliding under the covers like I'd never left. My breathing slowed, my eyes half closed, as if I'd been lazily waiting for him all along. He came out, towel around his waist, running his fingers through damp hair. "Morning," he said, with that casual warmth I'd once loved so much. I smiled back, tucking my phone out of sight, my secrets locked away where he'd never think to look. Inside, though, I was electric, wired with the thrill of knowing I'd just pulled the curtain back on his entire act. Every word he'd said to me since coming home now had a double meaning. Every touch felt like it belonged to a stranger. And yet, I played along, my laughter easy, my tone soft. Let him think I was still in the dark. That was the beauty of it. He'd never see me coming. As I handed him his coffee, I was already picturing the moment it would all fall apart for him. The stunned look, the silence in the room, the way the truth would land like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples everywhere. It wouldn't just be my satisfaction, it would be my justice. And now, the countdown had begun. A week later, the stage was set. Literally. I'd planned it down to the smallest detail, right down to the flowers on the table and the perfect wine to serve. I called it a welcome back dinner for Mark, a sweet little gathering so friends and family could hear about his trip. He thought it was my way of celebrating him, of making up for the time apart. And that was exactly what I wanted him to believe. That evening, the living room buzzed with voices and clinking glasses. His mother was there, his sister, 2 of his closest friends, and a few of mine. Mark was in his element, laughing, telling stories about late-night meetings and city views, looking every bit the devoted husband and hardworking man. I watched him, my smile fixed in place, my heart steady. I'd learned something over the past week. Power feels a lot like patience. Dinner moved along easily, conversation flowing, plates being passed, and then, right on cue, I stood up. "Before dessert," I said, my voice warm and casual, I have a little something for you, honey. Something you left in your luggage. His eyes flickered with confusion, just for a second, before settling back into that easy grin. That single flicker told me everything. He knew. I walked to the sideboard and picked up a beautifully wrapped gift box. Gold paper, silk ribbon, the kind of presentation that promised something sentimental inside. The room quieted, all eyes on me. I placed it in front of him, my fingers brushing the lid. "Go ahead," I said, keeping my voice light, almost teasing. "Open it." He hesitated for just a fraction too long before untying the ribbon. The paper fell away, and when he lifted the lid, his smile froze. Inside, resting neatly on tissue paper, was the black lacy bra. Next to it, the hotel bar receipt, and on top, the printed screenshots of those texts. Every word, every timestamp, every photo. The silence in the room was deafening. You could hear the weight of the air shift. Mark's eyes darted from the box to me, then to the guests, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for the right script. This isn't, he stammered, but his voice faltered. And in that moment, I didn't need to say another word. His performance had ended, and everyone had just watched the curtain drop. Before he could recover, his mother's chair scraped against the floor. She stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "I think we've heard enough," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence. The statement landed like a gavel, final and undeniable. Mark's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him before it even began. Around the table, no one moved. No one rushed to defend him. I stayed standing, my hands resting lightly on the back of my chair, meeting each person's gaze in turn. I wasn't looking for sympathy, and I wasn't here to explain myself. The evidence spoke louder than anything I could say. Mark avoided my eyes, staring down at the table like the wood grain could swallow him whole. The man who thrived on being the center of attention was now the centerpiece for all the wrong reasons. I took my seat again, letting the conversation stumble back in hesitant bursts, the kind people use when they're trying to pretend the world hasn't just shifted. But I wasn't pretending. I'd done what I came to do. And now, all that was left was to decide how, and when, I'd walk away for good. I didn't wait until morning. The moment the last guest left and the front door clicked shut, I walked to the bedroom, pulled my pre-packed suitcase from the closet, and set it on the bed. Mark trailed behind me, his voice low, trying to explain, to twist the story into something it wasn't. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at him. My focus was on the zipper, on the weight of my things neatly folded inside. I'd been ready for this moment since the day I found that bra. By the time he realized I wasn't bluffing, I had my coat on and my keys in my hand. "Sophie, wait," he started, but his words felt hollow, like they belonged to a man who knew the fight was already lost. I stepped into the hallway without another glance, the air outside cool against my skin, the night strangely quiet after the chaos we'd just left behind. I drove to my new apartment, the lease signed days ago, the fridge already stocked, the bed already made. Freedom didn't feel like fireworks, it felt like peace. And peace was something I hadn't realized I'd been missing until now. The fallout started faster than I expected. By the next afternoon, my phone buzzed with messages from friends, some pretending they hadn't heard, others bluntly asking if it was true. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The story was already moving on its own, weaving through our circle, stripping away the image Mark had worked so hard to protect. I imagined him, pacing in that house, scrambling for a version of events that might salvage his pride. I spent the day unpacking slowly, savoring the quiet of my new place. Every drawer I filled, every picture I hung on the wall, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd forgotten I owned. There was no scent of unfamiliar perfume here, no suitcase hiding secrets. Just my things, my space, my rules. The absence of him wasn't a void, it was a clearing, wide and open, waiting for something better. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped onto the small balcony, watching the city lights blink to life. Somewhere out there, he was learning how quickly a lie can unravel. And me? I was learning how light it feels when you finally set down a weight you've been carrying too long. The next morning, I opened my drawer and pulled out the bra one last time. It didn't feel heavy anymore, just a relic from a chapter I was glad to close. I placed it in a donation bag, along with a few old clothes, and dropped it off at a charity bin on my way to the beach. Let someone else decide its next story. Mine with it was over. Later, I sat on the sand, my shoes off, the sunset painting the horizon in gold and pink. I pulled out my phone, snapped a picture of the waves, and typed a caption for my social media. One man's mistake is another woman's freedom. Cheers to starting over. I hit post, smiled, and tucked the phone away. It wasn't meant for him. It was meant for me. A reminder that I'd walked through the fire and come out lighter. As the tide crept closer, I closed my eyes and breathed in the salt air. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder or question the truth in someone's voice. I was alone, yes, but I was free. And freedom, I realized, was the most beautiful thing I could ever wear.
De lost manuscript. The email from my stepmother arrived while I was grading freshman literature essays in my cramped office at Westfield Community College. Olivia, your father's estate is finally settled. The brownstone has sold. Harrison and I are dividing his personal effects this weekend. If there's anything specific you want, let me know by Friday. Otherwise, we'll assume you're not interested as usual. Victoria. I stared at the screen, the familiar mixture of grief and resentment churning in my stomach. My father had died 6 months ago, and this was the closest thing to a personal communication I'd received from Victoria since the funeral, where she'd introduced me to distant relatives as Robert's daughter from his first marriage. She teaches somewhere in Massachusetts. Not Dr. Olivia Blackwood, Associate Professor of Literature. Not published scholar of early American fiction. Just an afterthought, as I'd been for the 20 years since she'd married my father and given him Harrison, the son he'd always wanted. My name is Olivia Blackwood, 34, perpetually disappointing daughter of the renowned literary agent Robert Blackwood, who represented some of the most celebrated authors of the past 3 decades. I'd followed him into the world of literature, but not in the way he'd hoped. Instead of the prestigious publishing career he'd mapped out, I'd chosen academia, specifically the study of overlooked female writers of the early 19th century. Those obscure women scribblers he called my research focus at family dinners, writing domestic dramas that nobody remembered for a reason. I'd stopped attending those dinners after completing my doctorate. I typed a brief response to Victoria. I'd like to look through Dad's personal library and papers before anything is discarded. I can come Saturday morning. Her reply came almost immediately. Fine, 10 a.m. Harrison has already selected the valuable first editions for auction. Of course he had. My 26-year-old half-brother had followed perfectly in our father's footsteps, joining his literary agency straight out of his Ivy League education. He'd never read a book he couldn't monetize. That Saturday, I drove the 3 hours from western Massachusetts to my father's brownstone in Brooklyn. Now former brownstone, I reminded myself. The house where I'd grown up until my parents' divorce when I was 12 looked exactly as I remembered it. Imposing, elegant, filled with literary history. Victoria opened the door with an air kiss that didn't come within 6 inches of my cheek. Olivia, you look academic. I glanced down at my simple sweater and jeans. That would be because I am an academic. Harrison is in your father's study, cataloging. Most of the library has been boxed for donation, but you're welcome to look through it. She led me to the living room where dozens of cardboard boxes lined the walls. My heart sank as I realized I was looking at the dismantling of one of the finest private collections of American literature on the East Coast. You're donating all of this? There are probably rare editions. As I said, Victoria cut in. Harrison has already identified anything of actual value. The rest is just books. I bit back a response. To Victoria, my father's library had always been merely decorative, impressive shelving and leather bindings that complemented her interior design vision. That she couldn't tell the difference between a first edition Melville and a reading copy was something my father had found oddly charming. I'll start looking then. Don't take too long. The donation truck comes on Monday. Left alone, I began the overwhelming task of sifting through the box collection. Each carton I opened revealed more literary treasures. Not necessarily valuable in the monetary sense that would interest Harrison, but intellectually priceless. Annotated volumes with my father's distinctive marginalia, signed copies from authors he'd represented, books that had shaped American literary thought for generations. After an hour, Victoria appeared with coffee I hadn't asked for. Find anything worth keeping? The skepticism in her voice made clear she doubted I would. Actually, yes. I'd like to take these boxes. I gestured to several I'd set aside, containing works related to my research period and authors. She shrugged. Fine. Let me know when you're finished with your father's papers. Harrison needs to decide which client correspondence to retain for the agency archives. The study, my father's inner sanctum, was a wood-paneled room lined with built-in shelves that had once held his most prized literary possessions. Now it was half empty, with Harrison efficiently sorting through the remaining volumes and papers. The prodigal daughter returns, he said without looking up from his cataloging. Bit late, aren't you? Dad's been gone 6 months. Some of us don't have the luxury of dropping everything for extended bereavement leave, I replied. Community colleges aren't exactly generous with time off. Right, the noble pursuit of educating the masses. His tone made clear what he thought of my career choice. Well, don't get too comfortable. I've almost finished here. I looked around the room, memories flooding back. This was where I'd spent countless childhood hours, curled in the window seat with books while my father worked at his massive oak desk. It was where I'd first fallen in love with literature, long before it became a source of tension between us. What are you doing with his correspondence and manuscripts? I asked, noticing several bankers' boxes labeled client materials. Anything related to active clients comes to the agency. Personal correspondence goes to Victoria. The rest is trash. Trash? There could be important literary history in those papers. Harrison finally looked up, irritation clear on his face. If you're so concerned about literary history, maybe you should have shown more interest while Dad was alive. When was the last time you even spoke to him? His birthday? Christmas? The question stung because it contained a kernel of truth. Our relationship had been strained for years, our conversations perfunctory when they happened at all. But that didn't mean I hadn't cared. I like to look through his personal papers before anything is discarded, I said, ignoring his question. There may be materials relevant to my research. Your research on forgotten women writers nobody cares about. He rolled his eyes. Fine. Those boxes in the corner are headed for recycling. Knock yourself out, but anything you find related to his clients belongs to the agency. I spent the next several hours methodically sorting through decades of my father's notes, correspondence, and manuscripts. Most of it was mundane. Tax records, household files, correspondence with other agents and editors. Harrison periodically looked over my shoulder, making sure I wasn't pocketing anything of value to the agency. By late afternoon, with Victoria making increasingly unsubtle hints about needing to prepare for an evening engagement, I had filled my car with as many books and papers as it could hold. There was still so much to go through, but it would have to wait. I'll need to come back tomorrow, I told Victoria. That's not convenient. We have plans. Then I'll take more with me now and return what isn't relevant to my work. She sighed dramatically. Fine, but we need everything back or accounted for before the house closing next week. I loaded one final box into my trunk. A carton of mixed papers I hadn't had time to sort through properly, but that seemed to contain older material, possibly from before my father became a major agent. If nothing else, it would give me something to occupy my evening at the hotel. That night, sitting cross-legged on the hotel bed, I began sifting through the final box. Most of it was unremarkable, old contracts, letters from his early days in publishing, photographs from literary events in the 1980s and 90s. At the bottom of the box, however, I found something unexpected. A leather portfolio tied with faded ribbon, the kind used for manuscript submissions in the days before digital files. Inside was a typewritten manuscript titled Shadows of Salem by Elizabeth Gardner, dated 1988. I didn't recognize the author's name, but something about the manuscript intrigued me. The opening pages described a young woman in 1820s Massachusetts discovering her family's connection to the Salem witch trials. The prose was luminous, the historical details precise, the protagonist immediately compelling. I kept reading, unable to stop. Hours passed as I immersed myself in this unknown novel, the hotel room fading around me. By the time I reached the final page, dawn was breaking outside my window. The manuscript was extraordinary, a masterpiece of historical fiction that seamlessly blended actual events with a powerful narrative about women's autonomy, religious hypocrisy, and familial legacy. It was exactly the kind of work I studied in my research, yet I'd never heard of Elizabeth Gardner or this novel. More curious still, my father's notes were scrawled throughout the margins, enthusiastic comments that seemed completely at odds with his usual dismissal of women's fiction. On the final page he'd written, "Brilliant, revolutionary, will transform the genre." But if he thought so highly of it, why hadn't it been published? And who was Elizabeth Gardner? I searched online for any mention of the author or manuscript, but found nothing. The only Elizabeth Gardner who appeared in literary databases was an obscure poet who had published a single collection in the 1970s. The next morning, I arrived at the brownstone earlier than arranged, hoping for time to search for more information before Victoria and Harrison imposed their presence. To my surprise, Harrison was already in the study, efficiently filling a shredder with papers from one of the boxes I hadn't had time to examine. "What are you doing?" I demanded, horrified at the destruction of what might be important documents. "Cleaning up," he replied without pausing. "This is all ancient history from before Dad became successful. Nobody needs tax returns from 1985. I glanced at the papers feeding into the shredder. They weren't tax returns, they were letters, handwritten on personal stationery. "Stop, those aren't financial records. Those are personal letters. From nobody important," he said dismissively. I checked. I reached past him and pulled a half-shredded letter from the machine. The signature was still visible. "All I love, Elizabeth." My heart raced. Elizabeth Gardner. Harrison's expression changed subtly, a flicker of recognition quickly suppressed. Never heard of her. He was lying. "I found her manuscript last night," I said, watching him carefully. "Shadows of Salem. Dad thought it was brilliant. Why wasn't it published?" "No idea what you're talking about." He reached for the letter in my hand, but I pulled it away. "You do know what happened to Elizabeth Gardner and her manuscript?" Before he could respond, Victoria appeared in the doorway. "What's going on? Why are you shouting?" I held up the manuscript I brought with me. "I found this last night. A novel by Elizabeth Gardner. Dad's notes suggest he thought it was extraordinary, but it was never published. I'm trying to understand why." Victoria's perfectly composed face went completely still. "Where did you get that?" "In a box of Dad's old papers." "Who was she, Victoria? Why wasn't this published?" Harrison and Victoria exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "It's agency business," Harrison said finally. "Nothing to do with you. The manuscript is over 30 years old. Whatever agency business it was is long past. As a literary scholar, I'm interested in recovering important works, especially by female writers. Whoa. It wasn't good enough," Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp. "Robert ultimately decided it wasn't marketable. These things happen all the time in publishing." But that directly contradicted my father's notes in the margins. Every comment suggested he believed it was not just publishable but potentially landmark. "I don't believe you," I said. "Dad's notes say the exact opposite. Something else happened." "What was it?" Victoria straightened her already perfect posture. "This is exactly why your father found you so difficult, Olivia. Always questioning, always challenging, never simply accepting his expertise. Elizabeth Gardner wasn't publishable. End of story. Then you won't mind if I research her further? Perhaps even prepare a scholarly edition of this manuscript." Harrison stepped forward. "Actually, we would mind. Any unpublished manuscript submitted to Dad's agency remains the intellectual property of the agency unless rights were explicitly returned to the author. That manuscript belongs to us." "That's not how copyright works, and you know it," I countered. "The rights belong to the author, not the agent. Unless you can produce a contract saying otherwise, Elizabeth Gardner or her estate owns this work." "Fine," Harrison snapped. Good luck finding her. She disappeared 30 years ago, probably dead by now. His words confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. There was much more to this story than a simple rejection. What happened to her? I pressed. Why did she disappear? Victoria's icy composure finally cracked. Enough. This is ancient history that has nothing to do with you. Return the manuscript. It belongs with Robert's professional papers. I think I'll hold on to it while I try to locate Miss Gardner or her family, I said, tucking the portfolio under my arm. As a literary scholar, I have an ethical obligation to. As Robert's wife, Victoria cut in. I'm telling you to return it now. Something in her tone, a hint of panic beneath the anger, strengthened my resolve. I'll need to make a copy first, for my research. There will be no copies, Harrison said firmly. That manuscript is never going to see the light of day. Dad made that decision 30 years ago, and we're honoring it. Why? I demanded. What possible reason could there be to suppress an extraordinary work of literature for 3 decades? The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria and Harrison exchanged another look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Victoria sighed. Robert's study. Now. Once the door was closed behind us, Victoria poured herself a generous measure of my father's expensive scotch, something I'd never seen her do before noon. Elizabeth Gardner was a pseudonym, she said after a long sip. The author's real name was Elizabeth Garner. The name meant nothing to me. Aunt. She was your mother, Harrison said flatly. The room seemed to tilt around me. What? That's not possible. My mother was a high school English teacher. She never wrote a novel. Oh, she wrote it, Victoria said, her voice bitter. And your father was going to publish it, make her a star. He just started his agency, and this was going to be his breakthrough book. Then why wasn't it published? What happened? Victoria looked away. She left, abandoned you and Robert without a word of explanation. Just disappeared one day while he was at a publishing lunch. He came home to find you alone in your playpen and a note saying she couldn't do it anymore. This contradicted everything I thought I knew about my childhood. My father had always told me my mother died in a car accident when I was 3. That's not true, I said, my voice shaking. Dad said she died. He showed me her grave. There is a grave, Harrison acknowledged reluctantly, but she wasn't in it. Robert created that fiction to protect you, and himself. It was easier than admitting she'd walked out on both of you. My mind was reeling. So the manuscript. He suppressed it, Victoria confirmed. He was so hurt, so angry when she abandoned you both. He couldn't bear the thought of making her famous after what she'd done. So he buried the manuscript and her memory along with it. But she was my mother. Why didn't he at least tell me the truth when I was old enough to understand? By then, the story was set, Harrison said with a shrug. And after he married my mother, it seemed better to leave the past buried. I clutched the manuscript tighter. And my mother. What actually happened to her? Victoria and Harrison exchanged another glance. We don't know, Victoria admitted. Robert hired a private investigator years ago, but the trail was cold. She simply vanished. Or he told you she did, I said, pieces beginning to fit together in my mind. Just like he told me she was dead when she wasn't. I left the brownstone in a daze, the manuscript secure in my bag, my world completely upended. The mother I'd mourned might still be alive. The father I thought I knew had constructed an elaborate fiction that had shaped my entire life. And in my hands I held my mother's voice, her thoughts, her art, her extraordinary talent that had never reached the world. Back at my hotel, I examined the manuscript with new eyes. The protagonist, a young woman discovering her family's hidden history, now seemed painfully autobiographical. Had my mother been writing about her own life in some way? Were there clues in these pages that might lead me to her, if she was still alive? I began searching more thoroughly, using academic databases and resources unavailable to casual researchers. Elizabeth Garner was a common enough name, but with my university credentials, I could access records most people couldn't. 3 days later, I canceled my return to Massachusetts. My classes would have to wait. I had tracked Elizabeth Garner to a small town in northern Vermont, where a woman by that name had been teaching at a local college for the past 20 years. Her faculty photo, though showing a woman 3 decades older than my childhood memories, had my eyes. My father's jawline, my grandmother's high cheekbones. The drive to Vermont took 6 hours, each mile increasing my anxiety. What would I say to this woman who might be my mother? What could possibly explain her abandonment of a 3-year-old child? And why had my father lied so completely, creating a fictional death rather than the painful truth? The small liberal arts college where she taught was nestled among rolling hills, its campus quiet on a Sunday afternoon. Her faculty profile listed her as a professor of English literature, specializing in 19th century American women writers. Like mother, like daughter. The irony wasn't lost on me. I found her in her office, surrounded by books, grading papers much as I had been when Victoria's email arrived. The woman who looked up as I knocked on her open door had silver-streaked dark hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her eyes, my eyes, widened in shock. "Olivia," she whispered. Not a question, a recognition. "Elizabeth Garner?" I managed, though I already knew the answer. "Yes." Her hands trembled as she set down her pen. "You found me." "I found your manuscript first," I said, pulling the portfolio from my bag. "Shadows of Salem, the novel Dad refused to publish after you left." She reached for it with reverent hands. "I never thought I'd see this again. I assumed Robert had destroyed it. He kept it, hidden away with everything else about you." Her eyes filled with tears, including the truth. "Why did you leave?" The question burst from me, all my prepared speeches forgotten. "How could you abandon your child?" "I didn't abandon you," she said, her voice breaking. "Robert took you from me." And so the real story emerged, piece by painful piece. There had been no abandonment, at least not the way Victoria and Harrison had described. My parents' marriage had been unraveling for months. My father's controlling behavior, his jealousy of my mother's literary talent, his growing resentment as publishing professionals began to show more interest in her work than his fledgling agency. The final break came when he presented her with an impossible choice: give up writing or give up her family. When she refused both options, he'd locked her out of their home while she was at a meeting with another agent who had expressed interest in her manuscript. By the time she returned, my father had filed emergency custody papers, claiming she was mentally unstable and had threatened to harm herself and me. It was the 1980s, she explained, tears streaming down her face. "I had no money for legal fees. Your father had powerful friends in New York. The temporary custody order became permanent. Every time I tried to fight it, he threatened to have me institutionalized. Eventually, I had to leave to rebuild some kind of life. But I never stopped trying to reach you. I never received anything from you. No letters, no calls, nothing. I sent hundreds of letters over the years. Birthday cards, Christmas gifts. Robert must have intercepted them all." She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a thick folder. "I kept copies. I couldn't bear the thought that you might someday believe I hadn't tried." Inside were carbon copies of letters dating back to 1988, continuing all the way to my college graduation, which she'd attended from a distance, watching her daughter receive a diploma without being able to approach her. "Why didn't you try to find me when I was an adult? Once I was beyond his control?" "I did," she said simply. 5 years ago, I wrote to you at your university. I received a cease and desist letter from Robert's attorney in response, threatening a restraining order if I made any further attempts to contact you. 5 years ago, when I begun my doctoral research on overlooked female writers, when my relationship with my father had deteriorated to nearly nothing, the timing couldn't be coincidental. He knew I was studying women's literature. He was afraid I might stumble onto your manuscript, make the connection." She nodded. "It would have unraveled everything. His story about my death, his suppression of my work, the custody battle. Your father built his entire reputation on discovering and nurturing literary talent. Imagine the scandal if it became known that his first act as an agent was to bury what might have been a major work because of personal vengeance." I thought about the man I'd known, successful, respected, but perpetually disappointed in his academically inclined daughter who studied obscure women scribblers. Had he seen my mother in me all along? Had my choice of specialization been some unconscious attempt to find her? "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Elizabeth, my mother, looked down at the manuscript between us. "That depends on you. I've spent 30 years believing my only child thought I was dead or had willingly abandoned her. Finding out that you're not only alive, but following a similar academic path. It's more than I ever hoped for. And the manuscript? It's extraordinary work. It deserves to be published. After all this time, she gave a sad smile. The publishing world has moved on. Historical fiction about the Salem witch trials is hardly groundbreaking anymore. But recovering a suppressed work by a female author, especially under these circumstances, that's exactly the kind of literary discovery that scholars in my field live for. I hesitated, then added, we could work on it together. A scholarly edition with an introduction explaining its history and significance. Something kindled in her eyes, hope, perhaps, or the rekindling of an old dream. You would want to do that. After everything? I've spent my career trying to ensure forgotten female voices are heard, I said. Starting with yours seems fitting. 6 months later, I stood at a podium in a crowded university auditorium, introducing the speaker for our department's distinguished literary lecture series. Beside me sat Victoria Harrison and several of my father's former colleagues, all subpoenaed to attend as part of the settlement we'd reach after the truth about my mother's manuscript came to light. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, I said to the audience of students, faculty, and literary professionals. Dr. Elizabeth Garner, whose recently recovered manuscript Shatters of Salem has been described by Publishers Weekly as a lost masterpiece of American historical fiction. Following its publication next month by Reclamation Press, Dr. Garner will be teaching a special seminar here on women's voices in early American literature. As my mother took the podium to enthusiastic applause, I caught Victoria's eye in the front row. Her face was rigid with barely contained fury, not at the humiliation of being forced to witness this triumph, but because the settlement had included financial compensation that had decimated what remained of my father's estate. Beside her, Harrison looked merely defeated. His agency was struggling in the wake of the scandal that had erupted when the story broke about how his father had suppressed a major literary work out of personal vengeance. Several clients had already left for other representation. My mother began her reading, her voice strong and clear as she shared the words she'd written 3 decades earlier, words that had been hidden away, like she had been, like the truth had been. I'd spent my career searching for lost female voices in American literature, never imagining the most significant recovery would be so deeply personal. The manuscript hadn't just restored a potentially important literary work to public view. It had restored my mother to me, and with her, a more complete understanding of my own history and identity. As I listened to her read, I reflected on how thoroughly my father had constructed the narrative of our family, deciding which voices would be heard and which would be silenced. He had been the agent in every sense of the word, controlling the story from beginning to end. But stories have a way of resisting suppression. Words find their way to the surface, like buried seeds pushing through soil toward the light. And sometimes, the most powerful literary recovery isn't found in an archive or forgotten library, but in the spaces between the stories we're told about ourselves and the truths waiting to be discovered. After the lecture, as my mother signed copies of advanced readers' editions for an enthusiastic crowd, I stood slightly apart, watching this woman who had been both stranger and ghost to me for 30 years. Victoria approached, her designer handbag clutched like armor. "You've destroyed everything your father built," she said quietly. Was it worth it? I considered the question carefully. Dad built his career by controlling narratives, deciding which stories deserved to be told and which didn't. I'm simply continuing the family business, but with different criteria. He protected you, she insisted. Created a story that was easier than the messy truth. He protected himself, I corrected. And in doing so, he denied me my mother and the world a remarkable literary voice. That's not protection, it's control. Victoria's gaze shifted to where my mother was engaged in animated conversation with the department chair. She abandoned both of you. Whatever Robert's faults, he was the parent who stayed. That's still his version of the story, I said. I've chosen to hear hers as well before deciding what to believe. Later that evening, over dinner with my mother in my small faculty apartment, I showed her the final cover design for our book, Shadows of Salem by Elizabeth Garner, with a critical introduction by Dr. Olivia Blackwood. The subtitle read, "A Recovered Masterpiece of American Literary History." "It's really happening," she said, tracing the cover with her fingertip. "After all these years. Not exactly how you imagined it, I'm sure." She smiled, a smile I was still getting used to seeing, still finding echoes of in my own mirror. "No, it's better. The book is important, but finding you again, that's the real recovery. We talked late into the night, continuing the process of bridging 30 years of separation. There were still gaps to fill, wounds that might never fully heal. But we had begun the work of reclamation, of her story, of our relationship, of the truth. In my field, literary recovery is painstaking work, piecing together fragments, contextualizing lost voices, bringing forgotten narratives back into the canon. I never expected to apply those same scholarly techniques to my own life, recovering not just a manuscript, but an entire history that had been deliberately obscured. As my mother prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Your father wasn't wrong about everything, you know. He always said you were stubborn, persistent, unwilling to accept simple answers. He didn't mean those as compliments. Perhaps not, she acknowledged. But those are precisely the qualities that led you to find me, to uncover the manuscript, to insist on the truth. Sometimes the traits parents find most challenging in their children are exactly what those children need to become their true selves. After she left, I sat at my desk, surrounded by the scholarly apparatus of our forthcoming book, footnotes, historical context, literary analysis. But my mind was on the broader implications of what we had uncovered. How many other voices have been silenced over the years? How many manuscripts lay forgotten in attics or basements, suppressed by those with the power to control which stories reached the public? And how many other families were shaped by narratives as carefully constructed as the one my father had created? I couldn't answer those questions for others, but for myself, for my mother, for the remarkable manuscript that had brought us together again, I could ensure that this particular story finally reached the audience it deserved. Sometimes the most important scholarly work begins with the most personal questions, and sometimes finding a lost manuscript leads to recovering much more than words on a page. Nova Design needs fresh vision, Elena. Someone who understands the digital landscape, Trent Sullivan said, his eyes fixed on the sleek tablet in his hands rather than meeting mine. The board feels it's time for a transition. I sat motionless in the modernist chair facing his desk, the termination documents placed between us like a declaration of war. 26 years at Nova, from junior designer to creative director, ended with a rehearsed speech about company direction and evolving markets. Fresh vision, I repeated, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. My team just won the Richardson account, a $30 million project. Our biggest ever. And we're grateful for that contribution, Trent replied with practiced sincerity. He finally looked up, his 34-year-old face carefully arranged into what he probably thought was compassionate professionalism. But design is changing rapidly. We need someone who intuitively understands digital natives. Someone younger, you mean? I didn't phrase it as a question. Trent winced slightly. Your severance is 6 months' salary. Very generous, considering the standard is 3. The company appreciates your years of service, Elena. Service. Like I've been a loyal butler rather than the creative force that had built Nova Design from a boutique studio into one of the most respected firms in the industry. Who's taking over? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Aiden Mitchell will be stepping up as creative director. Aiden, my protagonist. I'd hired him 5 years ago, fresh out of design school, talented but raw, with more confidence than experience. I'd mentored him, championed his ideas, helped him refine his considerable talents, and now he was taking my job. I see, I said, gathering the termination papers. Well, I won't take up any more of your valuable time. I stood smoothing my charcoal pencil skirt and headed for the door. Trent called after me, Elena, I hope there are no hard feelings. This is just business. I paused, turning back with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Of course, Trent, it's just business. Walking through Nova's open concept workspace, all glass, steel, and carefully selected ergonomic furniture that I had personally approved, felt surreal. Designers and project managers glanced up as I passed, their expressions ranging from confusion to pity. News traveled fast in creative agencies. At my desk, my assistant Marco hovered anxiously. At 22, he was one of the youngest employees at Nova, brilliant with digital platforms and fiercely loyal. Is it true? He whispered, helping me gather personal items from my desk. Afraid so. The company needs fresh vision. I replied, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. That's bullshit, Marco said fiercely. Everyone knows you're the reason the Richardson account chose Nova. I smiled at his loyalty. Apparently, experience has an expiration date in this industry. What will you do? He asked, handing me a framed photo of my daughter Mia and me at her college graduation last year. I haven't thought that far yet, I admitted. Though that wasn't entirely true. Something was already forming in the back of my mind, not fully formed, but a spark of an idea. Whatever it is, I want in, Marco said without hesitation. I studied him for a moment. Careful. You have a promising career ahead at Nova. A career copying trends instead of setting them, he scoffed. I came to Nova to learn from you, not from some algorithm-chasing hipster who thinks good design is whatever got the most likes last week. His passion reminded me of myself at his age, before mortgages and single parenthood had made me prioritize stability over risk. Before I'd given my best years to a company that discarded me the moment gray started appearing in my dark hair. I'll be in touch, I promised, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Outside, I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at Nova's sleek building with its award-winning architecture. I'd helped select the architect, had worked closely with him on creating a space that reflected our design philosophy. Now I was being forced out of it because, at 52, I was deemed too old to understand what modern clients wanted. My phone buzzed with a text from Mia. Dinner tonight? I have news. Mia, my brilliant daughter, 24 years old with dual degrees in business and computer science, already making waves at her tech company. I'd raised her alone after her father decided fatherhood didn't fit his lifestyle goals. She'd watched me climb the ranks at Nova, sacrificing evenings and weekends to prove myself again and again. Yes, my place at 7. I have news too. That evening I opened a bottle of wine as Mia set our dinner table. She looked so much like me at her age. The same dark eyes and olive skin. The same determined set to her jaw when she was processing something important. So what's your news? I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Mia took a deep breath. I quit my job today. The wine bottle nearly slipped from my hand. You what? Why? I thought you loved working at Tech Fusion. I did at first, she said, taking a bottle from me to fill our glasses. But they keep sidelining my ideas. The project manager, this guy who's been there maybe 2 years longer than me, keeps taking credit for my work. When I called him out on it, he said I should be paying my dues before expecting recognition. The irony wasn't lost on me. Seems like we're both having career transitions. What do you mean? She asked, suddenly alert. I took a long sip of wine. Nova let me go today. Apparently, I'm not digitally intuitive enough for their evolving brand direction. What? Mia's outrage was immediate and fierce. After the Richardson campaign? After everything you've done for them? That's age discrimination, Mom. We should sue. I shook my head. And spend years in court while my career stagnates? No, I have a better idea. The spark that had been forming since I left Nova was catching fire now. Tell me more about that app concept you've been developing. Mia blinked, momentarily thrown by the change of subject. Designscape? It's an AI-assisted collaborative design platform. It would help teams create more cohesive brand experiences across different media. Why? Because I said, feeling more energized than I had in years, I think it's time I stopped building someone else's dream and started building my own. Our own. Mia's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You want to start a company, together. Think about it, I said, excitement building in my voice. Your technical expertise, my industry experience and connections. Your Designscape platform as our flagship product. We could create something that bridges the gap between traditional design excellence and digital innovation. Legacy design, Mia said immediately. That's what we'll call it. I raised an eyebrow. Legacy? Isn't that a bit old-fashioned for a tech-forward company? She grinned. That's the point. It honors experience while creating something new. A legacy isn't just about the past, it's about what endures and evolves. Plus, she added with a mischievous smile, it's a subtle middle finger to anyone who thinks expertise has an expiration date. I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. To legacy design then. We clinked glasses, and just like that, a new chapter began. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of activity. I liquidated some investments for startup capital while reaching out to my extensive network of industry contacts. Many were surprisingly eager to help. It seemed I wasn't the only experienced professional troubled by the industry's youth obsession. Daniel Ramirez, a former client who now headed marketing at a major tech company, was one of the first to offer support. An agency that combines deep design experience with cutting-edge technology? Count me in. We've wasted too much money on pretty interfaces that don't actually solve business problems. Meanwhile, Mia refined her Designscape platform, working marathon coding sessions with Marco, who had indeed quit Nova 2 weeks after my departure. They were joined by Priya Sharma, a brilliant UX designer who'd been passed over for promotion at her previous company in favor of a younger, less experienced designer. We set up shop in a converted warehouse space, not the gleaming glass temple that Nova occupied, but a space with character, history, and most importantly, affordable rent. As word spread about what we were building, more talent came our way. Surprisingly, not all were industry veterans cast aside by youth-obsessed companies. Many were young designers and developers who were frustrated by shallow work environments that prioritized trends over substance. Jason Kim, a 26-year-old developer who joined us from one of the hottest digital agencies in the city, put it bluntly during his interview. "I'm tired of building flashy garbage that breaks the moment the client tries to actually use it. I want to learn how to create work that lasts." 6 months after being unceremoniously shown the door at Nova, I sat in our growing office reviewing the prototype of Designscape with Mia and our core team. The platform was revolutionary, combining AI-assisted design tools with collaboration features that solved real problems design teams face when working across different media. "We're ready for beta testing," Mia announced, pride evident in her voice. "I've lined up 5 companies willing to pilot the platform and provide feedback." "Make that 6, Marco interrupted, looking up from his computer. "Richardson Industries just reached out. They want to be included in the beta." I couldn't suppress a smile. Richardson, Nova's biggest client, was now interested in our product. "And that's not all," Marco continued, unable to contain his excitement. "There's a rumor going around that Nova is struggling with the Richardson account. Apparently, their fresh vision isn't translating into effective deliverables." "We're not building this company on Nova's failures," I reminded him, though I couldn't deny feeling a certain satisfaction. "We're building it on our own strengths." That philosophy guided us through our first year, while we kept tabs on Nova's increasingly desperate attempts to recapture their market position. Our focus remained on creating something truly innovative. Designscape moved from beta to full release, quickly gaining attention throughout the industry for its unique combination of intuitive interface and powerful capabilities. Legacy design grew rapidly but strategically. We hired based on talent and creative vision, not age or trendiness. Our office became a dynamic mix of experience levels, each team member valued for their unique contributions rather than how well they fit some arbitrary cultural mold. Then came the call I'd been both expecting and dreading. "Elena Gilbert," I answered, not recognizing the number. "Elena, it's Trent Sullivan." His voice sounded strained, nothing like the confident tone he used when terminating me. "I was hoping we could meet. There's a matter I'd like to discuss with you." "I'm quite busy these days, Trent," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Perhaps you could tell me what this is about." A pause. "It's about a potential collaboration between Nova and Legacy. We've been impressed with what you've built, especially the Designscape platform." "Collaboration," I repeated. Interesting term. And what exactly would this collaboration entail? Another pause, longer this time. "We should discuss the details in person. Are you free for lunch tomorrow?" Curiosity won out over petty satisfaction. "Fine. Giovanni's at 1 p.m. The following day, I arrived at Giovanni's, an upscale Italian restaurant that had been a favorite client meeting spot during my Nova days. Precisely on time. Trent was already there, nursing what looked like a double scotch despite the early hour. He'd aged visibly in the last 18 months, new lines etched around his eyes, his designer suit hanging slightly looser on his frame. "Elena," he stood, extending his hand. "Thank you for meeting me." I shook it briefly before sitting down. "You mentioned a collaboration." He took a deep breath. "I'll be direct. Nova is struggling. We've lost Richardson and 3 other major accounts in the past 6 months. Aiden's direction has been problematic." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said neutrally, though I wasn't particularly sorry at all. "The board is considering drastic measures," he continued, "including a potential merger or acquisition." Your name came up repeatedly. I nearly choked on my water. You want Legacy to acquire Nova. We want to discuss the possibility of joining forces, he hedged, though his expression confirmed my interpretation. Your Designscape platform is exactly what our clients have been asking for, and your agency's reputation for combining innovation with solid design principles is precisely what Nova has lost. The irony was almost too perfect. The company that had discarded me for being too experienced was now seeking salvation from the very experience they had rejected. And what would my role be in this joint venture? I asked, already knowing I would decline but curious about how far Trent's desperation extended. You would lead the creative direction of the combined entity, he said without hesitation. The board recognizes that certain personnel decisions may have been hasty. Certain personnel decisions, I echoed. You mean firing me because I was too old to understand digital design, then watching as I built a more successful company specifically focused on digital design? Trent had the grace to look ashamed. We made a mistake, Helena. A serious misjudgment. I studied him for a long moment, remembering the humiliation of that day in his office, the severance papers, the condescending explanations about fresh vision. I'd appreciate your candor, Trent, but I'm not interested in acquiring Nova or merging with it. Legacy is doing quite well on its own trajectory. At least consider making a formal offer, he pressed. The Nova name still has value in our client list. What remains of it would complement your growing portfolio. I'll discuss it with my business partner. I conceded, though I already knew what Mia would say. But don't expect a quick decision. Back at Legacy's offices, I shared the lunch conversation with Mia in our conference room. They want us to buy them out. She laughed in disbelief. The same company that thought you were too old school to lead them. That's priceless. Karma has a certain poetry to it, I agreed. But we need to consider this from a business perspective, not a personal one. Mia sobered, shifting into the sharp business strategist I'd watched her become. Acquisitions are messy and expensive. We'd be taking on their overhead, their workplace culture issues, and whatever client problems cause their biggest accounts to leave. She shook her head. It doesn't make strategic sense for us. We're growing organically with a healthy culture and clients who specifically chose us for our approach. My thoughts exactly, I said, feeling a surge of pride in her clear-eyed analysis. But there might be value in cherry-picking some of their talent if they do go under. Mia's eyes lit up, including Aiden. I laughed. Now who's being petty? 2 weeks later, we gave Nova our official response. Legacy would not be pursuing an acquisition, but would be open to hiring selected team members if Nova's situation changed. The message was diplomatic but clear. We weren't interested in saving the company that had discarded me. 3 months after our meeting with Trent, Nova Design announced it was closing its doors after 32 years in business. The industry publication cited changing market conditions and increased competition in the digital space. But those who knew the real story understood. They had sacrificed accumulated wisdom on the altar of youth worship, and it had cost them everything. As former Nova employees began seeking new positions, we hired selectively, bringing on those whose portfolios showed genuine talent and who embraced our philosophy of blending experience with innovation. And yes, among them was Aiden Mitchell, the wonderkind who had replaced me as creative director. His interview was uncomfortable for both of us, his formerly boundless confidence replaced by humility born of failure. I made a massive mistake, Elena, he said frankly, not just accepting your position, but believing I could replace what you brought to Nova. The company needed evolution, not revolution. And what did you learn from that experience? I asked, neither warm nor cold, simply professional. That true innovation doesn't come from chasing trends or from discarding established wisdom. It comes from building on foundations while having the courage to experiment within frameworks that actually work. He met my eyes directly. I learned that 26 years of experience can't be replaced by enthusiasm, no matter how genuine. I considered him thoughtfully. Aiden was talented, that hadn't changed, and if he truly learned from Nova's implosion, he could be a valuable addition to Legacy. You'd be starting as a senior designer, not a director, I said finally. You'd need to earn any leadership position through demonstrated results and team collaboration. I understand, he said, relief evident in his voice. I'd welcome the opportunity to learn from you again, properly this time. 2 years after being told I was too experienced for the modern design landscape, I stood on a stage accepting the Industry Innovation Award for Designscape 2.0. Legacy Design had grown to 60 employees spread across 2 offices, with clients ranging from Fortune 500 companies to cutting-edge startups. We had built something that genuinely bridged generational approaches to design, creating work that was both timeless and timely. In the audience, I could see Mia beaming with pride, along with our diverse team of designers, developers, and strategists. Aiden sat among them, now leading our digital experience team after 18 months of solid work and genuine growth as both a designer and a person. This award recognizes innovation, I said into the microphone. But what it really celebrates is the power of perspective, the kind that can only come from combining different experiences, backgrounds, and approaches. I paused, looking out at the industry that had once deemed me too old to contribute meaningfully. At Legacy, we believe great design isn't about age, young or old. It's about understanding both what changes and what endures. It's about recognizing that trends come and go, but principles of human connection remain constant. In the back of the room, I spotted Trent Sullivan, now working for a smaller agency across town. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave a small, acknowledging nod. The future of design belongs to those who value all voices at the table, from the seasoned veteran to the fresh graduate. Because innovation doesn't emerge from homogeneity, it springs from the creative tension between different perspectives. After the ceremony, at our celebration dinner, Mia raised her glass in a toast. "To proving them wrong," she said with a grin. I shook my head, smiling as I raised my own glass. To proving ourselves right. We had done more than build a successful company. We had created a model that showed how experience and innovation could not just coexist, but strengthen each other. We had demonstrated that value doesn't diminish with age, it transforms and grows. And somewhere across town, I hoped the industry was learning that lesson, one client at a time.